Good morning and happy Sabbath. I hope you have had a good week, or even if it be a bad week, I hope that you're happy that you're in Sabbath communion that we are spending right now. And this morning, this message, I'm thinking it to be a standalone because we've just finished our series on death and living, which was quite long, but I thank you for sticking with me to go through the series. Now, this morning's sermon I titled as "A Lie for Life: Rahab's life-saving lie and Israel's life-saving God." Now, this sermon I got an inspiration, an inspiration from one of the questions that was raised from the teacher of Tozai. Well, I used to work at Tozai before I went to the seminary, and it was a good experience for sure. But last week I had an opportunity to talk with one of the teachers there. And this teacher, as she shared a Bible story on the story of Rahab in one of her classes, a student raised very good questions, and she shared that with me. And these are the questions that the student shared. He asked, hasn't God noticed Rahab's lie? I mean, do you remember the story of Rahab? The story goes like Joshua, when he was going to conquer the land of Canaan, sends two spies to this city called Jericho. And Rahab, in order to protect these spies, she lies. And so the student asks, hasn't God noticed? Because God hasn't condemned her for lying, right? And the follow-up question to that was, would it be permissible to lie if it is to protect God's people? And I'm thinking that the underlying question for this latter one is that, can lie be justifiable under a certain circumstance? Excellent questions, don't you think? I mean, if you are teachers, you would know that kids have great questions, right? They come up with just excellent questions that would baffle adults. And let me just say up front that these are not easy questions to answer. Right? As to the first question, I would just simply say that, yes, I'm sure God has noticed. If you look around the Bible, it is pretty clear that there's an emphasis on God knowing everything. Right? So I would say that there's not much question in regards to the first one. But then the second one is the tricky one, right? Tricky one. I mean, how would you answer to this difficult question? Like, is lie permissible if it is to protect someone's life? And this makes me think of, for example, more recently of the Holocaust. I'm sure that many people who hid the Jews under their roof might have lied in order to save them. Right? And in that case, would bearing false witness, which is explicitly condemned in the Ten Commandments, be violated without consequence? And now, today I would like to get into the story of Rahab as found in Joshua chapter 2. But let me just say in the beginning that most likely for most of you, this sermon will be unsatisfying because I will try to avoid answering this question because I don't know the answer to this question. And on top of that, as Richard he's a biblical scholar, writes in his commentary, it is best not excuse Rahab's actions, but neither to be troubled by them. The ethical issue is not the concern of the narrative. And I wholeheartedly agree with this latter part. I don't think this story is a moral lesson about lying and truth telling. I think this story has something else in mind that wants to convey. So to impose our question of whether lying is permissible in one circumstance or another may not be what the author of Joshua is trying to tell. So I would agree that perhaps to talk about the ethical issue and try to bring out the solution to that issue from this story itself might not be that fruitful. And therefore, with that in mind, although I may not be able to answer this mind-boggling question of the ethic of lying or truth-telling, let me just simply try to observe and describe what is taking place in this story of Rahab. Okay, so that's the goal of this sermon, for me to observe and describe what is taking place in this story. Okay? And I'm hoping that some hints, perhaps, might flow from this observation. So let's get into the story. It's found in Joshua chapter 2. Let me start from Joshua chapter 2, verse 1. It reads, "And Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, 'Go, view the land, especially Jericho.' And they went and came into the house of a," what? "Of a prostitute, whose name was Rahab, and lodged there." So here we see, as I've said already, the Israelites ready to go into the promised land, to go and overtake them. But before they do so, Joshua sent these 2 men as spies. And so these spies come to Jericho, and when they came, they went into the house of a prostitute. And I'm thinking that this perhaps was because these 2 men thought that if they would go into a shady place, they might be able to hide themselves from the authorities of this city. So they choose this spot. And what is interesting, at least to me, is that Rahab, since this point onward, is often, if not all the time, referred to as the prostitute. Okay? And these are the verses, this is not all-inclusive, but verses that will comment on Rahab later on. And you see, for example, Joshua 6:17, "Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live," says Joshua. And later on, "But Rahab the prostitute and her father's household," blah, blah, blah. And if you go to the New Testament, you see Rahab being praised by New Testament writers. But then even there, we see Rahab being called the prostitute. Right? "By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient." And in James, it said, "And in the same way was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works." And why I think this to be interesting is because when we look at Rahab's story, we may be caught up with whether her lie is justifiable or not, whether her action was right or wrong. But when we look at the biblical description of who Rahab was, or who Rahab was remembered as, she's not remembered as Rahab the liar, but rather the prostitute. And if you look at the Bible, you see that prostitutes are often looked down upon. I mean, it is condemned in the Old Testament, right? And that is why when Jesus comes and when he hangs out with these prostitutes and harlots, people are offended. because these people were, by virtue of their job, sinners. And perhaps to add to that, Rahab was even a foreigner, a pagan. And what this tells me is that whether Rahab's action of that one specific instance in lying was right or wrong, she herself was already a sinner. Whether she lied at that point or not, she was a sinner, period. And I might digress a bit, but I think that view is a bit important for us as well. Because we are often tempted to judge other people or even us by one specific action. Right? And depending on the rightness or wrongness of that one specific action, we easily judge our own person as well. And while I'm not trying to disregard the importance or significance of one action, I believe that we often tend to forget to look at a person in its entirety, in his or her entirety. And in that sense, Rahab, just like us, was a sinner, and she could only save herself by God's grace, not by doing the righteous act here in this one instance. If she was ever saved, that was by God's grace and God's grace alone. But let me get back to the story. So Rahab the prostitute invites these men into her house. And Joshua chapter 2, verse 2 to 3 says, "And it was told to the king of Jericho, Behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land. Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, Bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land." Now, I think it was either these spies were terrible at doing their job, or this reveals the alertness, the state of emergency that Jericho was in after hearing what these Israelites have done to other nations. So they come ask Rahab to bring out these men who have come to harm us. And to this, the controversial lines of Rahab is given. Verse 4 to verse 5. "But the woman had taken the two men and hidden them, and she said, True, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them." Now, did she not know where they were from? Well, later you will know that she did. And that was the reason why she hid them. Well, did she not know where the men went? Well, she did, because she hid them, right? Now, some scholars try to, do this and that to make this statement not a lie. But I think it's I think it's impossible. This is a lie. She knows. She intentionally tries to deceive the men sent by the king in order to hide and protect these two men sent by Joshua. So what do we make of this, right? Of this lie that was uttered in order to protect the man of God. And even though I said that I will not, read this text as treating or giving treatise on ethical issue, let me just throw a bit of ideas that gives us a reason why this issue of truth-telling and lie is a difficult matter. So again, this is a second digression in this sermon. I hope you'll follow me. But why this issue is difficult is because there are diverse opinions on whether lie could be permissible or not, whether lie could be justifiable or not. And very broadly or generally speaking, you could say that there are two opposites, two ends to this issue. On the one hand, some say that no lie, period. No lie is permissible under any circumstance. That's it. That's the one end. And on the other end, some would argue that lie is permissible depending on the purpose, depending on the motivation, depending on what it would accomplish. So for example, if it is to save lives, lie is good. It is not bad. Now, these are two extremes, and there are many opinions that would fall, I believe, under or in between these two ends. So some would argue that, in situations such as like war situation, lie is okay. Or some would say that, this lying and truth telling is not just about words, but it's about, our character or virtue. Or some would say that, some people deserve truth, but others do not deserve truth. So there is a mass confusion about on which side or on which opinion we would take on this issue of being truthful and of lying. And I would say that, even though these two are extreme, there are appealing points and also weaknesses. For example, no lie period might sound like harsh, like it would bring us question like, really? Right. Even in the circumstance of, you could save people by lying, really? Like no lie? And in that sense, lie, if it is for the good, might sound more appealing, right? But then perhaps the weakness of lie, if it is for the good, is that, what is good? And like, how sure can you be that your lie would accomplish the good that you aim at? Because, for example, Rahab, by telling the lie, ended up not giving up these two men. But was there a guarantee that by her lying, these men would be kept safe? And I found it interesting that a biblical scholar, Woodstruck, comments on this by saying, it is strange that the king's messengers were so quickly persuaded of the accuracy of this woman's words, and that no search of her house was instituted. And I think he's got a point. Why would they just go away, except that God had somehow worked it out? Wouldn't they at least try to see if this woman's testimony is correct or not? It is indeed strange that these king's messengers just went right away. And if they had doubted her words, would her lie still be justifiable if, for example, these men were caught? Or just to throw another if, if For example, like while Rahab was lying, these two spies thought that this woman would, surrender them, and therefore might have escaped on their own. And because she told that the king's men that these two spies went away, she lied that these two men went away, and they went, and perhaps these two men were caught because of her lie, right? And in that sense, I mean, her lie was no guarantee that these two men were to be saved. Right? And so some people might say that her lie perhaps manifests a certain lack of her faith in God. If she had really believed in God, she might have just said the truth and let God take care of the rest. So again, that was a long digression, but I hope you see the difficulty of trying to, give a black or white answer to this issue. But the fact remains the same, okay? But the record remains the same, in which Rahab lied with her intention to keep these two men in safety. And thus she said, I do not know, I do not know. So these king's messengers go away from her house, trying to pursue the spies. And now that they're gone, Rahab turns to the spies. In verses 8 to 9, reads, before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to them, I know. And I think this word is significant. Now her words, I don't know, I didn't know, moves to what she knows. She tries to make a true statement to these spies. I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. And in verse 10, she goes on to recall the past events that took place that gave fear upon the land. And then she concludes by saying in verse 11, the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Now that is quite a confession to make, isn't it? I mean, we don't know how much Rahab knew of this God of Israel. And for sure, she had her own gods. And yet here she admits, she boldly confesses her faith that this God, your God, Israel's God, is the God of all things, including Jericho and including myself. And she moves on to say, she makes an appeal to these spies. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as I have dealt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly with my father's house. And give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from them. Now here is revealed, I believe, why she lied to the king's messengers. She doesn't ask the spies, as I have lied, you also ought to lie. No. She asks the spies, as I have dealt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly. And so the way she actually manifested her kindness for these men ended up as lying, right? But what she wanted to do, what was important to her, was not about lying or truth telling, but rather showing kindness to these two strangers, right? And thus she appeals these two strangers to do the same to her, the foreigner, the pagan, the prostitute. Please show me kindness as I have showed you kindness. And as I read this, I couldn't but recall these famous words given by Jesus, which we often refer to as the golden rule. Jesus says, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. And he even says, for this is the law and the prophets. In other words, I mean, the Old Testament, the spirit of the Old Testament could be summed up in this spirit of do to others as you wish them to do to you. And although Rahab was not an Israelite, although she didn't have the Ten Commandments, although she has not heard of the law and the testimony from Moses or any of these people, it seems that she was moved by this spirit of the golden rule at this moment. To show the kindness which she would like the other to show for herself as well. And see how the spies react to this in verse 14. And the man said to her, our life for yours, even to death. If you do not tell this business of ours, then when the Lord gives us the land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. So how did the spies evaluate her action? They assessed her action of hiding them, of protecting them, and even lying was putting her life even to the point of death in order to save them, right? So do unto her back, in order to do unto her back, they had to say, our life for yours, even to death. They acknowledged to what extent Rahab went in order to protect them. It was risking life. Right? And then I will not read the rest of the chapter, but there are a bit more dialogues between Rahab and these two spies, and she sends them away. And we know the rest of the stories, and we'll see a few of the comments made on Rahab and her actions in the Bible afterwards. But in Joshua chapter 6, when this conquering is going to happen, Joshua tells the people, only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live. And see the reason why he says that. Because she hid the messengers whom we sent. And the same thing is repeated after they are saved in Joshua 6:25. And she has lived in Israel to this day because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Now notice that the rationale behind she being saved is not grounded on her lying itself, although that did play a part. But what they focus on is the fact that she hid the messengers. And in the New Testament, for example, in Hebrews chapter 11, which is often called the Hall of Faith, where we see these many heroes and heroines in the Old Testament exhibiting faith in different ways, we oddly perhaps find Rahab herself as well. And there, the writer writes, by faith, and we saw her confession of faith, right? By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because, why? Because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. Interesting way to put it, right? And in James as well, Rahab is picked up. And James chapter 2, just a bit of a context here. James is arguing that faith without work is dead. Faith should be accompanied, faith should be embodied with actions. And James brings up one example, and that is Abraham. And then the next example he brings up is Rahab. Okay. And there James writes in James 2:25, and in the same way, this same way referring to Abraham offering Isaac, okay, the great patriarch doing a faith action. And in the same way was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way. So oddly, and perhaps intentionally or deliberately, and for us, frustratingly, but these writers avoid talking about or even commenting about this one act of lying. They do not cast judgment on Rahab on this lying, and they do not give even an opinion on lying itself. But what they comment on is the fact that they treated kindly these two spies. She hid them, she friendly welcomed them, and she received them and sent them on another route. And that, according to Hebrews and James, revealed her faith in God, despite its perhaps imperfectness, and despite her action being perhaps faulty. And Howard on this, Howard is an Old Testament professor, writes on this. It was to Rahab's credit, however, and to God's credit, that her clear and enduring faith in Israel's God prevailed in the end over her momentary lapse into lie. God judged her ultimately by her enduring faith, not by her lie. And let me just close with another word from Hess. Hess concludes as a concluding word. Hess writes, the story of Rahab confirms God's welcome to all people, whatever their condition. Rahab exhibits faith and understanding of the God who saves her. So what this story reveals, I believe, and what this story points our attention to, probably shouldn't be this one act of lying and whether that was right or wrong, but rather why she did so and why she performed this series of actions in order to preserve these two spies. And that, I believe, as Hess writes, exhibits her faith and understanding of the God who saves her, although that faith might have been small or little at that time. And as I said in the beginning, I'm sure that we are all unsatisfied with the conclusion that I'm bringing down to. because I haven't really given an answer to this ethical question. And I honestly do not have an answer, really. Like, if we are to fall into the situation of Rahab, or perhaps in the situation of the Holocaust, in which it seems like these men, these women that we are hiding, these lives are dependent on us telling the truth or telling lies, what shall I do? What ought I to do? And honestly, I do not know. Yes, lie is wrong. And yet, when we are put into those situations, I can only ask God to tell me to guide me, to tell what He wants me to say at that right moment. And that is the only thing I can do, perhaps. But maybe what I can draw from this story is that God graciously accepted Rahab for what she could do the best, what she thought the best at the moment. Yes, her faith might have been immature at the moment. Yes, the way she tried to deal with the situation, that is by lying, might have been flawed. And yet, God still saved her because He was merciful. And what perhaps is surprising is more than these commendations of her, but is the fact that she's included in the lineage of Jesus Christ, right? God even chose to include her into the line of His incarnation. And so I hope that this story would challenge us, that this story would perhaps frustrate us, to really reflect on how God deals with us in our actions. To really think of how He graciously treats His people, despite our flaws. So let this story challenge you, continue to challenge you, and to continue to see Rahab's story and our lives in the light of God's strange graciousness. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this time to look at the story of Rahab and of how you have treated her and how you have commended her throughout the Bible. Although there seems, for us at least, to be some questionable deeds that she has performed. And I suppose this reminds us that, after all, Rahab, as well as all of us, are sinners. And no one action would make us right. And so may this story shape our perception on how we view ourselves as well as others and of the actions that we perform. And we thank you for a graciousness that prevails all things. Thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.